There's a sound you don't forget once you've heard it from the inside. A car door, locking. Mine locked at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, in the back corner of a Walmart parking lot, with my daughter's foot wedged against my ribs and my son's breathing slow and even in the seat beside her. I remember doing math in my head that night. Rent, gas, a box of cereal. None of it added up, no matter how many times I ran the numbers. I was 34 years old, and I was out of road. That was 5 years ago. Today, I unlock a different door every morning. It's the front door of a building with 40 beds, a kitchen that smells like coffee at 6 a.m., and a sign out front with my late wife's name on it. People ask me how you get from a parking lot to that door. The truth is, you don't get there in one step. You get there in thousands of small, ugly, necessary ones. I want to walk you through mine. Not the version with the music swelling under it. The real one. The slow one. The one that, by the time it's over, doesn't look like a struggle anymore. It just looks like a life, lived a little harder than most. Before all of it, my life looked ordinary, and I mean that as the highest compliment I can give. I had a wife, Sarah, who laughed louder than she needed to and didn't care who heard it. We had 2 kids, Mia, who was 8 and already correcting my grammar, and Eli, 6, who slept with 3 stuffed animals and called all of them Buddy, to keep things simple. I worked at a distribution center outside town, 12 years in, forklift certified, the kind of job where you know the schedule a month out, and you build a life around that certainty. We weren't rich. We were something better. For a while, we were stable. Mortgage paid on the first. A minivan with 200,000 miles on it that still started every morning. Sarah cut hair 3 days a week at a little salon near the school, and between the two of us, the bills got paid, and there was usually enough left over for pizza on Fridays. Then Sarah found a lump in the shower on a Sunday in March, and the word that came back from the doctor 2 weeks later was the kind of word that rearranges every room in your house without moving a single piece of furniture. I won't walk you through all 16 months of it, because if you've sat in those waiting rooms yourself, you already know the shape of it. And if you haven't, no description I give will be honest enough to matter. I'll tell you the parts that explain what happened next. I'll tell you that insurance covered less than you'd think, and that less than you'd think turns into thousands of dollars very quietly, one statement at a time. I'll tell you I started picking up every shift I could to cover it, which meant I wasn't in the room for some of the appointments, which is its own kind of debt you pay later in places that have nothing to do with money. I'll tell you that my manager, a decent man named Carl, gave me more slack than company policy allowed, for longer than he probably should have, and that I knew it, and that I was grateful in a way I never said out loud, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting how close to the edge we already were. And I'll tell you that by the time Sarah finished her last round of treatment, I had missed 11 shifts in 4 months, drained our savings account down to absolutely nothing, and gotten a written warning taped to my time card that I read in the parking lot before I went home and told Sarah everything was fine. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the disease. The arithmetic underneath it. The quiet, constant subtraction happening in the background while you're focused on the only thing that actually matters, which is whether the person you love is going to be okay. For a few months, it looked like she might be. I can point to the exact week things tipped from hard to unsustainable. It was the week the car payment bounced for the first time in our marriage, the week I started rounding down at the gas pump to the nearest dollar instead of filling the tank, the week Sarah, sitting up in bed thinner than I'd ever seen her, asked me how we were doing financially, and I told her we were fine. I have lied to a lot of people in my life. That was the only lie I have ever genuinely regretted, because she knew. She just let me say it. I want you to sit with that small, stubborn hope for a second, the way I got to sit with it, because it's the last easy thing that happens in this story for a long while. The hope didn't last. Sarah passed away on a Thursday in October, in a hospital room with bad fluorescent lighting and a view of a parking garage, and I'm not going to describe the rest of that day, because some doors stay shut even when you're telling the whole truth. What I can tell you is what came after, because that's the part that built the life I live now, even though it didn't feel like building anything at the time. It felt like falling, in slow motion, through floor after floor of a house I didn't know had so many basements. The funeral cost more than I had. I won't pretend that's a small detail. It's the detail that set the next 2 years in motion. I put it on a card, because what else do you do? And then I went back to work 8 days later because we needed the paycheck more than I needed time to grieve, which is its own kind of cruelty that nobody warns you about. I wasn't good at my job that month. I dropped a pallet I should have caught. I clocked in late twice because Mia had a meltdown at the bus stop and I couldn't leave her like that. None of it was dramatic. It was just enough. Carl pulled me into the office on a Tuesday and told me corporate was restructuring the shift, and we both knew what that meant, and he couldn't do anything about it this time. And I watched a man who'd covered for me for over a year look like he was the one who needed forgiving. I had 3 weeks of severance and a stack of medical bills that had outlived my wife. The math I'd been running for 16 months stopped being a metaphor and became the only thing I thought about. Rent was $1,100. I had 400 and change. My in-laws offered what they could, which was genuine and was also not enough, because they had their own kids and their own bad year. My brother lived 800 miles away with a one-bedroom apartment and a new baby. There was no spare room anywhere in my family with my name on it. The eviction notice came in November, taped to a door that still had Sarah's wreath hanging on it from the year before. I remember standing there reading it twice, like the second reading might say something different. I want to tell you I had a plan. I didn't. I had a minivan with decent tires, 2 kids who trusted me completely, and a tank of gas. So on a Tuesday night, after I told Mia and Eli we were going on an adventure, because I genuinely could not find a truer sentence that wouldn't terrify them, I drove to the Walmart on Route 9, backed into a spot near the cart return, and turned off the engine. Eli asked if we could keep the dome light on. I said no, save the battery. I have never hated a sentence I said to my son more than that one. Before we left the apartment for the last time, I walked through it once, alone, while the kids waited in the car. I didn't take much. A box of photographs. Sarah's reading glasses, which made no practical sense to keep and which I still have in my nightstand drawer to this day. I left the furniture, the dishes, a houseplant Sarah had kept alive for 6 years that I couldn't bear to watch die slowly in a car. I locked a door I knew I wasn't coming back through, and I stood on the step for a second longer than I needed to, doing nothing useful at all, just standing there, the way you stand at a grave. You'd be surprised how fast a person builds a routine out of almost nothing. Survival turns out to be mostly logistics. We had a system within a week. Mornings, I'd drive to the gas station on 5th before it got busy, and the kids would take turns in the bathroom with a gallon jug of water warmed on the dashboard overnight. Washing up, brushing teeth, getting into school clothes I kept ironed and folded in a laundry basket on the front seat. Because if the clothes looked right, nobody asked questions, and asking questions was the thing I feared most in the world. I parked 3 blocks from the elementary school, never directly in front, and walked them the rest of the way so no teacher would see what car they came from. Mia figured out we weren't staying with a friend within about 10 days. She didn't say anything for a while. She just started watching me in a way an 8-year-old shouldn't have to watch her father, like she was doing her own quiet arithmetic and didn't like the answer either. Eli, at 6, mostly thought it was camping. I let him think that as long as I could. There's a particular kind of mercy in a 6-year-old's imagination, and I used it without shame. Nights were the hard architecture of the whole thing. We had 2 blankets and a third one I'd bought for $3 at a thrift store that smelled like someone else's house. I learned which parking lots had security that left you alone until 2 a.m. and which ones didn't let you make it past 11. I learned that a 24-hour laundromat is one of the few places on earth where nobody looks twice at a tired man and 2 kids at midnight. I learned the Wednesday food pantry schedule at 3 different churches, rotating so we wouldn't become a familiar face anywhere, which I now understand was its own kind of pride. The expensive kind, the kind I couldn't actually afford. I kept a notepad in the glove box. Gas, $11. Cereal, $3.40. Quarter for the dryer. I wrote everything down like the numbers might eventually rearrange themselves into a different story if I tracked them carefully enough. Some weeks were better. A good week of day labor work. Unloading trucks. Moving furniture for a guy named Pete who paid cash and didn't ask questions. Meant 3 nights at an extended stay motel with a door that locked from the inside for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The kids would jump on the bed like it was a vacation. I'd sit in the bathroom with the fan running so they wouldn't hear me on the phone with collections or hear me not crying, which took more effort than crying would have. Other weeks weren't better. Other weeks, the math from that first night in the parking lot just kept repeating itself, a song stuck in a place I couldn't turn off. I want to be honest about something most people get wrong about being homeless with kids. It isn't a single terrible night. It's hundreds of small, ordinary, exhausting days stacked on top of each other. And the worst part isn't the hardship itself. It's how good you get at hiding it. I got very good. Too good, looking back. Good enough that nobody stepped in to help, because nobody knew there was anything to help with. I should say, too, that there were good moments in there, real ones, not just survival dressed up as resilience. Eli, learning to whistle in the back seat for 2 straight weeks until he finally got it. So proud of himself, he woke his sister up to demonstrate at midnight. Mia reading to her brother by phone flashlight, doing all the character voices, better at it than I ever was. Those moments didn't cancel out the hard ones. They just sat right alongside them, which I've come to think is closer to the truth of most hard years than any single, clean emotion would be. That changed on a Tuesday in February, around 2 a.m., with a flashlight against the window. The flashlight belonged to a police officer named Daniels. I remember his name because I made him say it twice. The way you grab onto small, useless details when you're too scared to process the big one. Someone in the apartments across the lot had called about a vehicle with children sleeping in it. I understand why now. At the time, all I felt was a kind of cold that had nothing to do with February. He asked me to step out of the car. He asked how long we'd been staying there, and I remember the careful word he chose, staying, like he already knew the real word and was being kind enough not to make me say it first. He shined the light gently into the back seat, not in the kids' faces, just enough to see they were breathing, warm, asleep in their coats. Mia stirred and looked at me through the window with an expression I still see sometimes when I close my eyes. Not scared of him. Scared of what happens to families like ours when an officer with a flashlight finds them at 2 in the morning. I have never in my life been more afraid of anything than I was of him reaching for his radio and saying the words, child welfare. I would have done anything in that moment. I would have lied, begged, run. I did none of those things. I just stood there in the cold with my hands a little raised, not because he told me to, but because some part of my body understood I needed to look like a man who wasn't a threat to his own children. He didn't call anyone. He looked at the back seat for a long moment, looked at me, and asked if I had anywhere else to go. I said no. He didn't lecture me. He pulled a card out of his jacket pocket, a little dog-eared, like he'd handed out a dozen of them that month, with a phone number for a family shelter intake line. And he told me to call first thing in the morning. And he said, I remember this exactly. Don't make me come back here, man. Not for this. He drove away. I sat back down in the driver's seat, and I did not move for a long time. I want to tell you, I felt grateful. What I actually felt was a shame so complete it had a temperature, a weight, a smell. The inside of that car at 2 a.m. with my kids breathing slow behind me and a business card sitting on the dashboard like an accusation. I had spent 4 months being so careful, so controlled, so determined to handle this myself, and one flashlight had shown me, in about 90 seconds, exactly how little control I actually had. That was the night I cried. Not at the funeral, not at the eviction notice. That night, in a Walmart parking lot, as quietly as I have ever cried in my life, so my kids wouldn't wake up to it. And somewhere underneath the shame, something else was sitting there too, small and stubborn, the same thing that had let me hope for a few months while Sarah was still fighting. I didn't recognize it yet. I just knew that when the sun came up, I picked up that card before I picked up anything else. I think about Officer Daniels sometimes, more than he probably knows or would expect. Not because of any single thing he did. He didn't drive us anywhere, didn't hand us money, didn't fix anything. He just declined to make the worst night of my life into an even worse one, and he pointed one tired man toward a door he was too ashamed to find on his own. I've learned, in the years since, that most of the help that actually changes a life looks exactly that small from the outside. Nobody writes songs about a flashlight and a business card. But I'm alive because of one, and so are my kids. I called the number from a gas station payphone because my cell had been shut off 3 weeks earlier, and I remember the woman on the other end asking very ordinary questions in a very calm voice. How many children? What ages? Do you have any income? Any vehicle? Any history of domestic violence in the home? And I answered every one of them like I was confessing to something. Even the ones that had nothing to be ashamed of. There was a waiting list. Of course, there was a waiting list. I learned a hard truth in that first phone call that took me years to fully understand. Needing help and receiving help are two completely different timelines, and the gap between them is where a lot of families like mine get lost for good. I got lucky. A spot opened up 11 days later. 11 days doesn't sound long until you're the one counting them from a parking lot. The shelter was a converted motel on the edge of town. 2 stories, exterior doors, a community room with mismatched couches, and a coffee maker that was always either empty or burning. There was a curfew. There were rules about visitors, about noise, about whose turn it was to clean the shared bathroom on our floor. I'm not going to pretend it felt like freedom, exactly. It felt like a different kind of small, after months of a kind of small that could kill you. What it actually gave us, underneath all the rules, was a bed that didn't move when you turned over, a refrigerator with our name on a shelf inside it, and a case manager named Ruth who looked at my intake folder for about 4 minutes before she looked up at me and said, "Okay, let's figure out what you actually need, not just what the form asks." Nobody had talked to me like that in months. Most people, even kind ones, talk to a homeless man like he's a problem to be processed. Ruth talked to me like I was a person who'd had a string of very specific, very fixable problems, which is a different thing entirely, and it changed how I saw myself faster than I expected anything to. The kids slept 11 hours that first night. I sat in the hallway outside our room for part of it, just listening to the quiet, the actual quiet, no engine, no parking lot noise, nothing. Mia told her teacher the truth about 2 weeks later. Her teacher, it turned out, had already guessed. The same wrinkled uniform shirts, the tired eyes, the way Mia flinched a little whenever anyone mentioned going home. The school had a fund for exactly this. A few $100s meant to quietly cover things like winter coats and field trip fees for kids in situations nobody wanted to name out loud. Mia came home with a brand new coat and didn't tell me where it came from for a week, like she was protecting me from something. I started looking for work the same week, with an actual address to put on the application for the first time in months. That single fact, an address, turned out to be one of the most powerful tools I'd held in my hand in a year. I didn't understand yet how many people never get handed that tool at all. I would understand it fully later when I started handing it to other people myself. The shelter had a rule I didn't appreciate until much later. Nobody on staff ever asked us how we'd ended up there. Ruth told me once that the question doesn't help anybody. It just makes a person relive the worst year of their life for an audience that doesn't actually need the details to do their job. What they asked instead was simpler. What do you need this week? What's the next step? 1 week at a time, which turns out to be the only size a life can actually be rebuilt in any way. I got hired at a different distribution center 2 towns over, night shift, which worked out better than I expected. I could be home, or what passed for home, in time to get the kids up for school, and Ruth helped me arrange a rideshare voucher for the first month until my first paycheck cleared. Night shift work is its own particular grind. You sleep in pieces. You miss things, a school play, a stomach bug at 3 a.m. that someone else has to handle, half of every normal conversation about what happened during daylight hours. But I was earning again, and earning, after that year, felt like a kind of oxygen I hadn't realized I'd been rationing. 6 months in, I hurt my back lifting a pallet that was loaded wrong by someone on the previous shift. Nothing dramatic, no ambulance, no headline. Just a slow, grinding injury that turned into weeks of light duty at reduced pay. Then physical therapy I almost skipped twice because the copay competed directly with groceries. I want to tell you about that specific kind of fear because it's a fear most people who've never been close to the edge don't recognize. The fear that your own body, the only asset you actually have left, might fail you next after everything else already has. I did the physical therapy. I did it angry, mostly, doing the exercises in the shelter's tiny gym room at 5 in the morning before my shift, furious at a body that had decided this was the moment to be fragile. Ruth helped me apply for a short-term assistance program to cover the gap in pay. Paperwork I would have been too proud to fill out a year earlier. I filled it out without flinching that time. Pride, I was learning, was a luxury item, and I had sold most of mine off already just to survive. We didn't slide back into the car. I want you to know that, because I know how close it came, closer than I told anyone at the time. There were 2 weeks where the math from that first parking lot night came back, word for word, digit for digit, sitting on my chest at 4 a.m. We made it through on a combination of that assistance program, a food pantry I'd once been too ashamed to use, and an envelope system I'd started. Cash and labeled envelopes on the closet shelf, rent, groceries, gas, emergency. Each one guarded like it held something sacred, because it did. Mia turned 9 that year. We celebrated in the shelter's community room with a grocery store cake and 6 other families who'd become something like a second, temporary family of our own. People who understood, without me having to explain it, exactly what kind of year it had been. Eli stopped calling it camping around then. I remember the exact afternoon he asked, very matter of fact, the way 6-year-olds ask the questions that level you completely. Dad, are we still poor? I told him the truth. I said, we're getting less poor every week, buddy. That's the whole plan. He seemed satisfied with that. Kids, I learned, don't need certainty nearly as much as they need a plan they can believe you're actually following. The physical therapist who worked on my back, a quiet guy named Hassan, told me something during one of those 5 a.m. sessions that stuck with me longer than most advice does. He said most people treat recovery like a straight line and get blindsided when it isn't one. He said the muscle doesn't care about your schedule. It heals at the pace it heals at, and your job is just to show up for it anyway, on the days it's working and the days it feels like nothing's changed at all. I didn't know it yet, but he was describing more than my back. We moved into our own apartment 14 months after that first night in the Walmart parking lot. 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, a radiator that clanked all night the first week until we all learned to sleep through it like it was a heartbeat. I remember standing in the empty living room before the furniture, what little we had, got moved in. Bare walls. A mattress propped against one of them. Mia and Eli running from room to room shouting about who got which one. Their voices echoing in a way that meant the place was actually ours. No curfew, no shared bathroom schedule, no case file with our name on it sitting in someone else's filing cabinet. I sat down on the floor in the middle of all that empty space, and I didn't move for a while. Not from sadness this time. From a kind of exhaustion that finally had nowhere urgent left to go. It would be a clean story if I told you that was the end of the hard part and the beginning of the good part, and in a lot of ways, it was. But something else had been collecting in me during those 14 months at the shelter, something I didn't fully understand until I had the quiet and the safety to actually look at it. I kept thinking about a man named Robert. Robert had come into intake about a month after us, with his 2 daughters, 12 and 15. The shelter's policy, a policy that existed for genuinely sound safety reasons I came to understand later, didn't allow fathers to share a facility with teenage girls who weren't their own children for the protection of every kid under that roof. It meant Robert got sent to a men's facility across town, alone, while his daughters stayed at ours with a temporary guardian arrangement that nobody seemed thrilled about, including the staff enforcing it. I watched those girls eat dinner in the community room without their father for 6 weeks. I watched the younger one stop talking much at all. I never found out what happened to that family after they left, because that's the nature of shelters. People pass through and the doors close behind them, and you're left holding a worry you have no legal right to follow up on. I wasn't angry at the policy. I understood exactly why it existed. But I kept turning the same question over for months afterward. Where does a family like Robert's go when the systems designed to catch families like mine simply weren't built to hold families shaped a little differently? How many versions of Robert were out there, sitting in a different parking lot tonight, because the help that existed didn't quite fit the shape of what they needed? I didn't have an answer. I didn't have a plan, a degree, a network, or a dollar to spare for an idea like that. What I had was a stubborn, specific itch that wouldn't go away, the same itch that had once let me hope quietly for a few months while Sarah was still fighting. I was starting to recognize that itch by then. It was usually right before the longest climbs of my life. I brought it up to exactly one person that year. Ruth, on a Thursday, half joking, the way you float an idea you're not ready to be laughed at for. She didn't laugh. She just said, write down what you do differently. Not someday. Tonight. I went home and wrote 2 pages on the back of a school flyer. Mostly questions, mostly things I didn't know how to do yet. I kept that flyer for years, folded into the back of a notebook, moving apartment to apartment with us. A strange little artifact of the exact moment an itch turned into something closer to a decision. Ruth was the one who said it out loud first, almost a year after we'd moved into the apartment. We were sitting in her cramped office, where I now came by occasionally just to update her on the kids, not because I needed anything, which felt like its own kind of milestone. You know, you talk about this stuff like someone who's already doing the job, she said. I asked what job. She said mine. Sort of. A version of it. She told me about a county certification program for peer support specialists. People with lived experience of homelessness, addiction, or crisis, trained to work alongside case managers, translating the system for people too overwhelmed to translate it themselves. 6 months, evening classes twice a week, a manageable cost if I applied for the waiver, which Ruth helped me do before I'd even fully agreed to enroll. I want to be honest about something here, because the version of this story where I sailed through is not the true one. I had not finished a textbook since high school, and high school had not exactly been my strong subject. I sat at our kitchen table after the kids went to bed, reading the same paragraph about crisis intervention models 4 and 5 times before it landed, furious at myself in a way that felt embarrassingly familiar from a decade earlier. I failed a practice exam halfway through the program. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside the testing center. A different parking lot, a different kind of sitting in a car, and seriously considered quitting. Mia found the failed practice test on the table the next morning. She was 11 by then, sharper than I gave her credit for most days, and she read it without saying anything for a minute, then looked up and said, "You made it through worse than a test, Dad." I don't know where an 11-year-old learns to say something like that with that much weight behind it. I think she learned it from watching me, which is a humbling thing to realize about your own kid. I passed the program 4 months later. Not at the top of the class. Solidly, honestly, in the middle, which felt better than top of the class would have, because it meant I'd actually earned every point of it the hard way. I started volunteering 10 hours a week at the same shelter that had taken us in, answering intake calls on Tuesday evenings, the same kind of calls I'd made from a gas station payphone 3 years earlier. 6 months after that, a part-time staff position opened up, and Ruth didn't just recommend me for it. She told the director, in front of me, "This is the best hire you'll make this year." And I had to look at the floor for a second so nobody would see my face. Somewhere in those months, talking to families on the intake line, hearing versions of Robert's story more often than I expected, the itch I'd been carrying since that empty apartment afternoon stopped being a vague feeling and started becoming an actual plan, written on the back of intake forms, in the margins, in the Notes app on a phone that finally stayed connected. I never told the people from my old life, the salon where Sarah used to work, Carl, anyone from that version of us, what I was quietly building toward. Some bridges you don't rebuild. You just build something new a little further down the river. But I thought about Sarah often during those evening classes, the way she used to come home smelling like other people's shampoo, exhausted, still asking about our day before she'd even taken her coat off. I think she would have recognized the man sitting at that kitchen table at midnight, reading the same paragraph for the 5th time. I think she would have said it was about time. It took 3 more years to turn a margin note into a building with a working furnace, and I'm going to compress those years more than they deserve, because if I told you everything, this video would be longer than the shelter took to build. The short version: I learned that starting a nonprofit is mostly paperwork wearing the costume of a mission, articles of incorporation, board meetings in Ruth's living room with 3 other people who believed me before there was much reason to. A grant application process that rejected us twice before a small community foundation said yes to a number that covered about a third of what we needed. We found the building 18 months in, an old two-story motel, very similar in bones to the shelter that had once taken us in, which felt less like coincidence and more like the universe being a little on the nose about it. It had been empty for 4 years. The roof leaked in 3 places. The man who owned it, an older guy named Frank who'd run it as a motel for 30 years before retiring, gave us a lease so far below market value that I'm fairly certain he did the math on what he was losing and decided he didn't care. We renovated it ourselves, mostly. Volunteers on weekends. A retired electrician from my church congregation who donated 4 months of evenings. Mia, 15 by then, organized a painting crew of her high school friends one whole spring break instead of going anywhere, and I never asked her to do that. She just showed up with 5 other teenagers and a stack of paint rollers, like it was obvious. Eli, 13, mostly carried things and complained about carrying things, which felt like its own small, ordinary miracle. A kid bored by the work instead of frightened by what the work was for. There was a moment, about 6 weeks before we were supposed to open, when it nearly didn't happen. A grant we'd counted on for the kitchen renovation fell through over a paperwork technicality, and we were short almost $11,000 with a fire inspection deadline already on the calendar. I sat in that half-finished building one night, alone, and felt something close to the parking lot feeling again. The math not adding up, no matter how many times I ran it. A local news reporter, doing an unrelated story on the old motel's history, found out what it was becoming and asked if she could include a line about it. One line turned into a 6-minute segment. The segment turned into something I still don't fully have words for. Small donations, 50 here, 200 there, an anonymous check for $4,000 with a note that just said, from one parking lot to another, which is the only time in this whole story I have ever completely lost composure in public. We made the number. We passed inspection 9 days late, which the county let slide. The night before we opened, I walked through every room alone with a flashlight, the same kind of flashlight Officer Daniels had once shined into my back seat, and I sat down in what would become the family lounge, in a building with my late wife's name about to go up over the front door, and I let myself, for the first time in 5 years, actually believe it was real. Frank came to the opening, in a suit I'd never once seen him wear, and stood in the back of the room the entire morning looking like a man trying very hard not to cry in public, and mostly succeeding, and I never did ask him why an old motel he'd written off as a loss seemed to mean quite so much to him. Some questions you let stay unanswered out of respect, not curiosity. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I share stories like this one because I think most of us are carrying some version of a parking lot somewhere in our past, and it helps, sometimes, to hear that someone else found their way out of theirs. Now let me tell you about the morning we opened. It was a Thursday in April, 5 years almost to the week from that first night with the dome light off and the engine cooling. I'd planned to spend the morning on logistics, staff schedules, a ribbon I'd bought at a craft store, a short speech I'd rewritten 9 times, and still felt wrong reading out loud. At 7:40 a.m., before we'd even unlocked the front door, a car pulled into the lot. An older sedan, packed tight, a woman in the driver's seat who looked like she hadn't slept in longer than one night, and 2 kids in the back seat. A girl who looked about 9, a boy who looked about 6, both still half asleep, coats on, the way kids look when getting dressed happens in a car instead of a bedroom. I want to tell you I handled that moment with some kind of practiced calm. I did not. I stood in the doorway of a building with my late wife's name on the sign above me, watching a woman live the exact morning I had lived 5 years earlier almost to the day, and for about 10 full seconds, I could not make my legs move. Her name was Denise. Her son's name was Marcus. I'm not going to tell you the rest of her story, because it's hers to tell, not mine, but I will tell you that she was the first family to walk through our doors, and that Ruth, who'd driven over that morning just to see the place open, technically not even on shift, was the one who sat down with her first, with that same 4-minute pause before saying, "Okay, let's figure out what you actually need." I named the shelter Sarah's Place, after my wife, and I'd told people for 2 years that the name was a tribute, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that Sarah is the reason any of this happened at all, not because of some final wish or deathbed plan, nothing that clean. She's the reason because the love and the loss of her cracked something open in me that never quite closed back up the same way, and everything that came after, every parking lot and food pantry and failed practice test, grew out of that crack. Mia, 19 now and home from her first year of community college to help with the opening, stood next to me on the front steps that morning. She didn't say much. She just put her hand on my arm the way she used to when she was 8 and figuring out, quietly, exactly how bad things were. This time, her hand on my arm meant something entirely different, and we both knew it. I'd rewritten my speech 9 times, and in the end, standing at the podium with the ribbon still uncut behind me, I skipped all 9 versions and said something closer to this, that I used to think a building like this one was for other people, the kind of people whose lives had gone wrong in ways mine hadn't. I told them I was wrong about that, the way I suspect most of us are wrong about exactly how close any of us live to needing a door like this one. Then I cut the ribbon with a pair of scissors my daughter handed me. The same scissors, it turned out, she'd used to trim a friend's hair the week before, a small, strange echo of her mother that nobody else in that room would have caught. We've helped 143 families since that Thursday in April 5 years ago, 5 years inside the story, 5 more years running the place. I know that number exactly because I still keep a notepad, the same habit from the glove box of a minivan a long time ago. I just write different numbers in it now. Last month, I drove past that Walmart on Route 9. I don't avoid it anymore. I used to, for years, taking the long way around town just to skip that intersection. This time I pulled in. I parked in roughly the same spot, near the cart return, and I sat there for a minute with the engine off, the way I used to. Except this time there was no math that didn't add up. There was just a man in a car in a parking lot, remembering another man who used to sit in that exact spot, and finding, to my own surprise, that I didn't feel pity for him. I felt something closer to respect. Eli's 18 now, taller than me, talking about studying social work, which is either irony or inheritance, and I haven't decided which, and I don't think it matters. Mia calls every Sunday, usually from a college library, usually asking some version of how the families are doing, which tells me she carries more of this with her than she lets on. Ruth still works 2 doors down from my office, technically past the age most people retire, and we still argue about the coffee maker, which is still either empty or burning. I kept Officer Danielle's card, the dog-eared one from that night, in the parking lot. It sits in the top drawer of my desk at the shelter now, not because I need the number anymore, but because I never want to forget how much one tired stranger's small decision can change about a person's next 5 years. I don't know what's sitting in your particular parking lot tonight. Maybe it's not a literal one. Maybe it's a hospital bill, or a job that ended, or a person you lost who you're still doing math around, trying to make the loss add up into something that makes sense. I'm not going to tell you it gets easy, because it didn't. Not for me. Not on any of the nights I've told you about tonight. I'll just tell you it gets possible. One ugly, unglamorous, necessary step at a time. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit follow, and send it to 5 people who might need to hear it tonight. You never know which one of them is sitting in their own version of that parking lot right now. Leave a comment and tell me honestly what part of this stayed with you. And tell me what story you want to hear next. I'm always looking, and the next one might be closer to home than you think. I'll see you tomorrow.